Happy 4th of July, Crimestituents! I hope everyone is having a great day of sun and burgers and just taking a break from work. Oh, and fireworks, of course. I'm not going to the National Mall for fireworks this year, but I will be watching from my house. We can kind of see some of the fireworks, and it'll be a good day. My pets are not afraid of fireworks, thank goodness, and so we don't have to worry too much about them. I don't know, maybe we'll drive to the bridge to get a better view. We shall see. But I have a really fun 4th of July tradition where every year I make this Jell-O cake. I have these Jell-O molds in the shape of an American flag from the 90s. And you basically just take red and blue Jell-O and you do different layers on it. And then to make the white Jell-O, you do yellow Jell-O, which rhymes, with Cool Whip in it. And anyways, it makes this like red, white, and blue layer cake in the mold. And it's one of my favorite things to do, and it's delicious. So I'm very, very much looking forward to my little Jell-O cake this year, putting little blueberries in the star like holes to make it healthy, I guess. And yeah, so that'll be my day. A little bit of fireworks, a lot of Jell-O, a lot of red 40. Gotta love it. I also want to give a shout out to the Ford Theater. I went there over the weekend and had the best time. It is such a cool museum. If you live in the area or you're visiting the area, you should absolutely go. I went with a friend and my husband and learned so much about Lincoln's life and the Civil War, and importantly for this episode, the Lincoln assassination. So a lot of the information that I got for this episode actually came straight from that museum. And so if you're not able to make it to the museum, here's a little taste for you in this session. But for real, if you go, you get to go across the street to the Peterson House, which is where Lincoln died. And it's a really cool experience. So 10 out of 10 recommend. We also went to Walk and Roll, which is in Chinatown. But more importantly, for our purposes, it is at the Mary Surratt boarding house. They have a little plaque out front that says, details about the Mary Surratt boarding house. And now it's a walk and roll, which is kind of funny. But I had some good sushi there, talked a lot about the Lincoln assassination, and then went next door for some private karaoke where you could rent out a room for the hour. And we made some ears bleed. It was a very successful weekend. If you're looking for a little bit of history, a little bit of sushi, and a little bit of karaoke, hit me up because I have the perfect itinerary for you. All right, so I am very excited to dive back into the Lincoln assassination. I have officially become a nerd for the Lincoln assassination. I am talking about it to everyone that I know, and every single time I have a conversation about it, I end up telling someone something they didn't know about the assassination. So I promise, even if you are a history buff, you're going to learn something new from this session, so stick around. All right, without further ado, hi, I'm Harley, and we're gaveling in another session of Crime in Congress. When we last spoke, Booth had entered Lincoln's box at the Ford Theater and fired a single shot from his minuscule weapon. Like, y'all, it is teeny tiny. If you haven't seen it, it's on display at the Ford's Theater Museum, but it's maybe the size of my hand, and there are definitely people who wouldn't even be able to fit their finger through the hole to pull the trigger. If you are above 6 foot, you probably can't fit your finger through the hole to pull the trigger. But we're going to back up a little bit because, like I mentioned earlier, I took a little field trip to Ford's Theater and learned some interesting new tidbits that I want to sprinkle into this session for you. So before we get to the assassination, let's back up to the events of April 11th, 1865. 2 days after the end of the Civil War and the fall of the Confederacy, when General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, President Abraham Lincoln gave a speech, as one would expect from the commander-in-chief, following the end to a bloody war that claimed more than 600,000 lives. As someone who works in political communications, I cannot imagine having a full 2 days to prepare a speech like this after a war. Today, we would be lucky to have 6 hours, but the news cycle moved at a different pace back then. Lincoln stood facing the White House lawn as throngs of people waited with bated breath to hear their leader's vision for a Reconstruction America and his message of unity, particularly when it came to the treatment of former Confederates and those who were enslaved. Here are a few key excerpts from his speech that day. "We meet this evening not in sorrow, but in gladness of heart. The evacuation of Petersburg and Richmond and the surrender of the principal insurgent army give hope of a righteous and speedy peace, whose joyous expression cannot be restrained. In the midst of this, however, he from whom all blessings flow must not be forgotten. A call for a national thanksgiving is being prepared, and we will be duly promulgated. Let us all join in doing the acts necessary to restoring the proper practical relations between these states and the Union, and each forever after innocently indulge his own opinion, whether in doing the acts he brought the states from without into the Union, or only gave them proper assistance, they never having been out of it. It is also unsatisfactory to some that the elective franchise is not given to the colored man. I would myself prefer that it were now conferred on the very intelligent and on those who serve our cause as soldiers." Basically, to summarize all of that, he's saying that now is the time for celebration. We need to come together as a country, not as former Confederates and the Union. And he believed that people who were formerly enslaved, who were smart, or who fought for the Union deserved the right to vote. Fun fact, this is just a fun fact for me at least, microphones weren't invented until the 1870s, which means unless he was using a megaphone, which, also fun fact, is a term popularized by Thomas Edison, also in the 1870s, then he was giving this speech on the White House lawn without any vocal amplification, which is kind of crazy to think about. That means people were gathering to witness something they probably couldn't even hear. Anyway, you didn't come here to learn about the history of microphones, did you? Now, who would be in the crowd that day, listening to an unamplified Lincoln? Then none other than John Wilkes Booth and Lewis Powell. This was after their failed kidnapping attempts, and while they were plotting a potential assassination. Booth turned to Powell and made an ominous prophecy. That is the last speech he will ever give. Dun dun dun. 3 days later, on April 14th, 1865, Lincoln took breakfast at 8 a.m. with First Lady Mary Todd Lincoln and their sons, Tad and Robert, presumably in the White House. John Wilkes Booth was fast asleep at this hour in room 228 of Washington's National Hotel after a night out drinking and celebrating the end of the war. At 9 a.m., Lincoln makes a promise to Speaker of the House Schuyler Colfax that he will give members of Congress at least 60 days' notice before calling them back for a special session of Congress to pass Reconstruction legislation. Nowadays, you're lucky to get 72 hours notice, but I guess that's the difference between air travel and horse and buggy for transportation. Meanwhile, Booth was waking up for the day and headed down to the hotel dining room for breakfast. At 10 a.m., Lincoln met with the new Minister of Spain, former New Hampshire Senator John P. Hale, whose daughter, T here, was in a relationship with John Wilkes Booth. The irony. But it gets messy, because he and the daughter might not have been exclusive. At that same hour, 10 a.m., that Lincoln is meeting with the Minister of Spain, Booth is seen eating his breakfast accompanied by two, quote, female admirers. Shady stuff for a man supposedly in a relationship. At 11 a.m., Lincoln sent a message to Ford's Theater, not too far from the White House, letting them know that he would be attending that evening's performance of Our American Cousin. Clandestinely, also at 11 a.m., Booth walks his butt down to Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. Not sure why it was being delivered there, but okay. When he learns of the message that was sent by the president confirming his attendance at that night's performance, and that Ulysses S. Grant would be his honored guest. Bingo. Lincoln would be spending the evening on Booth's home turf. He knew the place well, would not surprise anyone by showing up, and had advance notice of the president's whereabouts. The plan he'd been stewing about for months was officially in motion, and this time he was determined not to fail. Now, let's take a pause in recounting the order of events on April 14th, and let me give you a little update on where all of the men involved in this kidnapping plot that happened beforehand were at this point, and who is going to play a key role in the events that follow for the rest of this fateful day. You'll remember Booth had a falling out with Michael O'Loughlin and Samuel Arnold, his childhood friends, after the failed kidnapping attempt, and the two decided not to indulge Booth's more outlandish fantasies any longer. They were done, and it was probably the smartest decision these two ever made. John Surratt Jr. wasn't around for this fateful day either. While supportive of the plot, he had left for Canada on a mission authorized by Judah P. Benjamin, the Confederate Secretary of State. This left David Harold, Lewis Powell, Mary Surratt, and George Asssarate in D.C. to carry out Booth's plans for the President, Secretary of State, and Vice President. Okay, let's get back to April 14th. At noon, Lincoln holds a cabinet meeting with General Grant in attendance, and they proceed to have fiery debates about Reconstruction policy. This goes on for 2 hours, after which Grant pulls Lincoln aside and politely declines his invitation to join him at the theater that evening, as he and his wife were headed out of state to see their children in New Jersey. Also at noon, Booth stops by a stable to rent a horse for the evening, which he would need for his planned escape. This takes about an hour, and by 1 p.m. he heads over to Mary Surratt's boarding house, where he delivers a package. You'll remember from part 1, this was the package that she delivered to John Lloyd in Surrattsville, containing a pair of binoculars. And during this visit, she warned Lloyd that men would be there later that night to pick up the guns that he was secretly storing and had been for weeks. Very ominous heads up from Mary. While Lincoln is wrapping up his cabinet meeting, Booth leaves the Surratt house and goes to Grove's Theater. While there, he writes a letter to the editor for the National Intelligencer. This wasn't your average letter, though. It was what we would consider today to be a manifesto. He outlines that his plans had gone from kidnapping Lincoln to assassinating him, and signs the letter with not just his own name, but the names of his co-conspirators. He really said, if I'm going down, y'all are going down with me. He gave the letter to John Matthews, who was in the production of My American Cousin, that was being performed that night, to be delivered to the editor of that paper the next day. At 3 p.m., after doing some administrative work and meeting with Maryland politicians, Lincoln goes for a carriage ride with his wife to Navy Yard. For those of you who aren't familiar with D.C., Navy Yard is in southeast Washington. Today, it keeps the name but is better known for overpriced bars, Republican congressional staffers, and floods of interns, more than it's known for the actual Navy. The purpose of their visit that day was to tour the USS Montauk, which was an ironclad vessel, or boat, used by the Union Navy during the Civil War. This will come back around, so remember the name Montauk. The first couple concluded their tour at 4 p.m., at which point they headed back to the White House. Mary remarked to her husband during the travel, quote, "Dear husband, you almost startle me by your great cheerfulness." Which, knowing what we know, is rather ironic, dare I say ominous, thing to say. But at the time, they were happy and had no reason not to be. At 5 p.m., they're back at the White House, and Lincoln has a chat with Illinois Governor Richard Oglesby. He reads excerpts from his favorite comedian to the group, then joins his wife Mary for dinner, late, I might add, at 7 p.m. He hurriedly eats his meal because he needed to get to another meeting with Speaker Colfax, presumably to continue their discussion about the next legislative session. If I were Mary, I would be kind of annoyed. You come to dinner late and then you have to rush through it to go to another meeting. I've been in Mary's shoes and it bugs me every time. So I like to imagine that Mary was a bit PO'd with Lincoln right about now. In the middle of all of this, at 6 p.m., Booth has a drink at a bar next to Ford's Theater before returning to his hotel for supper. This is where he crosses the T's and dots the I's of his diabolical plan and makes this foreboding comment to a clerk. "There's going to be some splendid acting tonight," he says, discussing the evening's play at Ford's Theater. Once again, dun dun dun. At 8 p.m., Lincoln writes a quick note to Massachusetts Congressman George Ashmun, confirming their appointment for the next day, at which point his work for the day is complete. Finally, because that sounds like a busy and exhausting day for the president. That's when he meets Mary on the North Portico, where a carriage is waiting to take them to Ford's Theater for an evening of culture and relaxation. On the way, they pick up their guests for the evening at the corner of 15th and H Streets, Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, who was the daughter of a New York Senator, Ira Harris. Like I mentioned in part 1, the Lincolns were late to the performance, arriving at 8:30 p.m. to a fully decorated box and a roaring crowd that paused the show to welcome him. Also at 8 p.m., Booth meets with Lewis Powell, George Asssarad, and David Harold at the Herndon House. They go over their plans. They plot. They scheme. They shake hands. Then they leave. It's officially game on. At 9 p.m., Lincoln gets cold. Don't know how that's possible because they're in a crowded room with no AC, but okay. And puts on his overcoat. While Lincoln is dressing his goosebumps, Booth arrives at the back of Ford's Theater and crawls through a narrow passage called Baptist Alley on his horse. He dismounts and recruits a stagehand, Ned Spangler, to take care of his horse for him. Ned agrees, and then opens the door, allowing Booth to enter the theater for what no one yet knew would be the final time. At 10:15, Mary and Lincoln begin holding hands, a rare form of PDA for the first couple. And the sole actor on the stage, Harry Hawk, delivers the best joke of the entire play. "Don't know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal. You sock-dologizing old man-trap." If you didn't laugh at this, don't feel bad because I didn't either. Just general rule of thumb, if you need a dictionary to understand a joke, it's probably not going to land. But at the time, this joke was a real knee slapper, and the crowd erupted in laughter. They wouldn't be laughing for long. Because at that same moment, John Wilkes Booth was at the door of the presidential box, which he opened with a leg of a wooden music stand that he'd left there in preparation for his murderous deeds. Standing just a few feet behind the president, he reached into his pocket and grabbed the tiny gun he'd prepared for the night. He raised his arm, pointing it mere feet behind the president's left ear, and pulled the trigger. Boom. It was Major Rathbone who reacted first. I heard the discharge of a pistol behind me and, looking around, saw through the smoke a man between the door and the president. At the same time, I heard him shout some word, which I thought was freedom. I instantly sprang towards him and seized him. The two wrestled for a time until Booth was able to wiggle himself free and pull out a knife that he had packed for the occasion, sending it hurling towards the major. Rathbone avoided a fatal blow, moving in time for the knife to slide between the crack of his side and left arm, shaving off inches of muscle as it burrowed deeper into his flesh. Rathbone, not yet feeling the pain, grabbed at Booth's clothes before he lunged over the side of the presidential box, a 12-foot drop to the center of the stage. His foot caught an American flag that had been decorating the box, causing him to fall at a weird angle and break his leg. "Sic semper tyrannis," he yelled, Latin for "thus always to tyrants," before making his way out the back exit and towards his stowed horse. "Stop that man!" Rathbone yelled. The audience had been stunned into silence, confused by what was going on. Keep in mind now, Booth was a famous actor who performed in that same theater. Everyone knew who he was, and many assumed that it was just part of the show. The only person who could process what was happening with enough speed to do something about it was an audience member who jumped over the entire orchestra pit and ran after an injured Booth. In the box, as the gunpowder smoke settled to reveal Lincoln's slumped body, Mary screamed. The audience was no longer laughing. This was not part of the show. Something happened to President Lincoln, and they all watched as the perpetrator escaped on a now stolen horse. While all of this was going down at the theater, another plot was underway in Lafayette Square. Secretary of State Seward was at home, recovering from a pretty intense injury that he got in a carriage accident, which left him with a broken jaw. His doctor, Dr. Verdi, had given him some medication, dressed the wound with a jaw splint, and told him to rest. Little did the doctor know at the time, but this jaw splint would very likely save Seward's life. The stillness of the house was broken by a knock at the door from two men who were not recognized by the home's occupants, but we know to be Lewis Powell and David Harold. They came with a rather believable story. William Bell, the Seward servant, was told that the men had a prescription that needed to be delivered to the secretary at once. Considering the amount of pain he was in, at first, Bell didn't think twice about this. He reached out to grab the prescription from the men, but was denied. Instead, they insisted that they were under direct orders from the doctor to deliver this straight to the secretary. "I told him I would not let him up," Bell said. "But if he had any package of medicine for Mr. Seward, I would take it up and tell him how to take it." When the men insisted that this was not a suitable outcome and that they must enter the home to see the secretary, Bell started to get a little bit suspicious. Not one to be intimidated, though, he stood his ground, letting the men know in no uncertain terms that Seward was resting and not taking visitors at this time. Bell would later say that he had, quote, spoken very rough with them. Despite his strong demeanor, he was no physical match for the men who were standing before him, and Powell pushed him out of the way to gain entry into the home before barreling up the stairs towards the bedrooms. His accomplice, Harold, remained outside, as it was his job to help Powell escape the scene once the deed was done. When he went up, he walked pretty heavy, Bell said, recounting that he asked him to walk quieter so as not to disturb Seward. The ruckus downstairs caused the Assistant Secretary of State, Frederick Seward, yes, the Assistant Secretary of State was the Secretary of State's son, aka one of the OG American political Nepo babies, to rise from his bed and see what all the commotion was about. As he exited his bedroom, he saw a broad man standing just outside of his father's quarters, where he confronted him. The man repeated to Frederick that he was there to deliver medication, and just like Bell, Frederick insisted that the men would not see the secretary that day, and should leave the medicine with him. He's asleep, Frederick said, giving a rather reasonable and simple explanation as to why they were not going to go into the bedroom. If two random men came into my bedroom while I was sleeping, I'd be pissed, even if they were actually there to deliver medication. I think I would be more upset that they woke me up than I would be that they were doing whatever the heck they were there to do. Despite the house's tenants' attempts to save Seward's sleep, the noise woke him up, and his daughter, Fanny, went out into the hall to deliver the news. "Fred, father is awake now," she said. The man now believed that they should gain entry into the room, since Seward was no longer sleeping, thanks to their own belligerence, I might add. But still Fred wouldn't cave. For minutes, they argued back and forth, with Fred remarking that, quote, he made the impression on me of being rather a man dull of comprehension, since he just wasn't getting the point that he wasn't going to get to see the secretary. "It is not worthwhile to talk any longer about it," Fred said. "You cannot see Mr. Seward. I will take the responsibility of refusing to let you see him. Go back and tell the doctor that I refuse to let you see him if you think you cannot trust me with the message." Done trying to resolve this dispute diplomatically, and refusing to leave without accomplishing his intended mission, Powell pulled from his jacket a revolver and pointed it squarely at the Assistant Secretary of State. "There was no time for thought or reflection," Fred said. "I remember only thinking, at the moment, there is an additional reason why he should not go in." I love that even when a gun was pointed at him, he was able to maintain a sense of humor. What a king. Punching the barrel of the gun into Fred's temple, Powell pulled the trigger, but the gun misfired. That was probably a touch embarrassing for Powell, and a huge relief for Fred. But undeterred, Powell took the barrel of the gun and hit Fred across the head, causing him to fall down the stairs and leaving a gaping hole in his head. Bell, deciding that he was no match for the broad man with the gun, hauled his butt out of the house screaming, "Murderer! Murderer!" Not really the most helpful way to go about this, but I can't say I would react much better if I were unarmed in this situation. And let's just be honest, I am always unarmed in every situation. And it's not like he could call 911. So Paul revering it was probably the best way to go if he wanted to find help. Amidst the chaos, Powell entered the secretary's room, ready to make April 14th his last night earthside. Since the gun wasn't working, he resorted to a secondary weapon, the knife that he packed with him. But to his surprise, the secretary wasn't alone. Instead, Private George Robinson, an army nurse, was there tending to the secretary. In an instant, he was pushed over and bleeding from the face and forehead, unable to even comprehend what was happening to him or the man he had been charged with caring for. Finally, Powell's path to Secretary Seward was clear. He raised the knife high over his head, bringing it down on the man's already injured jaw, and slashing his neck and face repeatedly. As Powell assaulted this highly decorated public servant, Robinson came to and instantly jumped back into action. As soon as I could get on my feet, he said, I endeavored to haul him off the bed, and then he turned upon me. In a moment of quick thinking, the secretary rolled off the bed onto the floor, even with his broken bones, disappearing into the darkness. Believing the secretary to be dead as he lay bleeding in a mess of sheets, Powell resumed once again assaulting Robinson. By this point, Major Augustus Seward, another one of Seward's sons, was woken up and came into the room to find a chaotic and harrowing scene. But remember, there's no electricity at this point, and he was still wiping sleep from his eyes. When he saw the men wrestling at his father's bedside, he assumed that his father had gone delirious and was fighting with his nurse, not realizing that his father was laying motionless on the floor. The minute he grabbed hold of Powell, though, he recognized his mistake. He didn't know who the heck this man was, but he certainly was not his father. Terrifying, right? He wrestled the unfamiliar man into the hallway, where beneath gaslight he was able to begin to see the features of the random intruder, who he described as large and beardless with straight dark hair. On reaching the hall, Augustus said, he gave a sudden turn and sprang away from me. Dropping his knife on the ground, he leapt out of the house and onto his waiting horse, disappearing into the thick of the night. He left alone, as Harold dipped the second he heard the screaming and wanted nothing more to do with it. I guess technically, even though he was supposed to help Powell escape, his job was done because he got Powell to the house, and so he went off to find Booth and aid in his escape instead. Powell left in his wake a terrified family, blood spatters, injuries, and a croaking Secretary of State who was nearing death. And a miracle. The secretary was still alive. I am not dead, he whispered. Send for the police and surgeon and close the house. Despite his right cheek being gashed open to reveal the bone below, the jaw splint prevented the knife from going any further, saving the man's life and foiling a key part of Booth's murderous plot. While all of this was going down, a third crime was underway. It was George Atzerott's turn to murder the vice president, completing the third prong of Booth's diabolical plan. But, much like the attempted assassination of Secretary Seward, things wouldn't exactly go according to plan. To put it kindly, George chickened out. He wasn't interested in actually killing someone, which, fair, but didn't have the stones to tell Booth that. So, instead, he got drunk, likely to silence the anxiety brewing inside of him, and never followed through with his plan or even attempted to. Which is a good thing, obviously, but even a stopped clock is right twice a day, right? And that, Crimestituents, is where I'm going to leave you for part 2 of the Lincoln assassination. In part 3, which I hope will be the final part, but I haven't written it yet, so I can't be sure, we will get into the aftermath of the Lincoln assassination, the hunt for Booth and his co-conspirators, and the eventual trial. There is a lot more juicy and salacious content to come, so turn on your notifications for Crime in Congress, rate us 5 stars, and get ready, because the ride is far from over. Oh, and if you're in DC, make sure to stop by Ford's Theater. They even have a mention of the seances that Mary held in the White House, which we covered last year on the pod. It's a great episode that you should definitely check out. And with that, will you help me gavel us out?